The boy was unconscious, so was his mother. He had just walked in from school expecting a quiet afternoon when he saw the man who was pinning his mother down. Without thinking, he grabbed the nearest object he could find, a dumbbell, and charged. It was all instinct, pure adrenaline as he swung, hoping to protect her. But the attacker wasn't finished. He wrestled the weight from the boy's hands and with one blow struck him down as the room went silent. What happened in those moments left doctors speechless and the country divided. But to understand what really happened, we have to go back to the moment when a killer moved in next door. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more, thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Natalia Krapovina lived in a modest, shared apartment block in Severodvinsk, a small industrial city tucked away in the northwest corner of Russia. The building was densely packed, like most Soviet-era housing. Families with young children, elderly couples who had lived there for decades, neighbors who all knew each other's routines. It was the kind of place where personal space was minimal, and nothing stayed private for long. Natalia lived there with her only son, Ivan. He was 15, reserved, and soft-spoken, the kind of boy who kept to himself but was always polite. He went to school, came home on time, and never gave his mother any trouble. They didn't have much, but they had each other. And for Natalia, that was everything. But things changed when a new tenant moved in. His name is Roman Pronin, and he wasn't just another neighbor. He was a 37-year-old convicted murderer, recently released from prison and quietly placed back into the community. But there was no notice and no warning, just a quiet administrative decision to house him there, on the same floor as families, children, and mothers like Natalia. And she was terrified. She had heard the whispers before most others. The building's maintenance staff spoke in low tones, and someone at the housing office let it slip that Pronin had done time for something violent, though no one seemed to know, or want to say, exactly what it was. But Natalia didn't need details. She felt it in her gut. Something wasn't right. So she did what any mother would do. She went to the authorities multiple times, she filed complaints, asked for explanations, and pleaded for him to be relocated. She made it clear that she didn't feel safe, not with her son living under the same roof as this man. "He's dangerous," she warned the neighbors. "He shouldn't be anywhere near children." But nothing changed. There were no interventions, no protections put in place, not even a formal response. Her concerns were buried beneath bureaucracy and silence. And so, despite her warnings, Roman Pronin stayed. And that decision, ignored by the very people who should have listened, set into motion a chain of events that would forever change their lives. It was early afternoon on May 1st, 2017, a public holiday in Russia, and 15-year-old Ivan Krapovin had just finished school for the day. He was walking home, unaware that the moment he stepped through that familiar front door, his life would never be the same again. Back at the apartment complex, his mother Natalia had just stepped outside for a moment, maybe to take out the trash, or maybe just to catch a breath of fresh air. But that small window of vulnerability was all it took. That was when Roman Pronin appeared. He had been drinking, heavily. His behavior was erratic, and his breath reeked of alcohol. He approached Natalia directly, blocking her path, slurring his words, and making an unwanted proposition. It wasn't subtle or a misunderstanding, it was aggressive, direct, and deeply disturbing. Natalia refused immediately, pushing past him to return to the safety of her apartment. But he followed. Not just to argue, not to intimidate, he followed her inside with intent. And that's when it happened. The very scenario she had warned authorities about. The fear she had voiced in meetings, in letters, in hallway conversations with anyone who would listen. It was unfolding in real time, and no one was there to stop it. Pronin grew agitated and then enraged. He shoved his way into the apartment, and Natalia screamed. It wasn't a scream of surprise. It was the kind of scream you let out when you already know no one is coming to help. And then he didn't stop. He was no longer just an unwanted neighbor. He had crossed a line that could never be undone. The hallway was quiet when Ivan returned home that afternoon. He turned the key, pushed open the door, and stepped into what should have been just another ordinary day. But something was wrong. There was no sound of his mother in the kitchen. No familiar clatter, no warm greeting. Instead, there was a noise, low, panicked, and desperate, coming from further inside the apartment. And then he saw it. His mother, Natalia, was on the floor. She was being held down. Her clothes were torn, and the man on top of her, Roman Pronin, was holding a knife. There was no time to process or time to think. Without a word, he dropped his school bag and scanned the room. Then he saw it. A 3-kilogram dumbbell resting near the corner of the couch. He grabbed it and charged forward. Ivan swung the dumbbell with everything he had, striking Pronin once, hard. The force of it made the man stumble, but not fall. Instead, he turned, now enraged, now fully focused on the boy who had dared to fight back. And then, it happened fast. Pronin tore the dumbbell from Ivan's hands and, without warning, brought it down on his head. Once, then again, and a third time. Each blow was more forceful than the last. The weight crushed into Ivan's skull, and he collapsed beside his mother. And in that moment, the man who had been allowed to move in despite every warning stood over 2 silent bodies, believing his violence had ended everything. But it hadn't. It had only begun. Pronin looked at them, mother and son, and assumed he had killed them both. He didn't check for a pulse. He didn't call for help. Instead, he turned, walked out, and closed the door behind him as if trying to seal away what had just happened. But he wasn't done yet. Before disappearing, Pronin made a phone call, not to the police, and not to a hospital, but to a friend. "Come help me dispose of 2 bodies," he reportedly said. He had already decided what to do next, and it didn't involve remorse. However, that phone call didn't go the way he expected. The friend on the other end, shocked and horrified, refused. And instead of showing up at the apartment, they did the one thing that Pronin hadn't counted on. They called the police. Within minutes, law enforcement arrived at the scene, and so did the paramedics. The door was forced open, and what they found inside was devastating. 2 bodies, a dumbbell lying near Ivan's side, and a knife near Natalia. For a moment, even first responders weren't sure if either of them had survived. But there was still time, just barely. Natalia Krapovina had been stabbed 27 times, and every second mattered, so they rushed her into surgery, hoping that speed might give her a fighting chance. But it was Ivan who left the doctors speechless. He was unconscious, completely unresponsive, with visible fractures to his skull. The dumbbell had done catastrophic damage, crushing the front of his head with such force that it shattered bone and compressed brain tissue. There was no telling how long he had been without oxygen or how much of his brain function remained. He was taken straight into emergency surgery, and what the surgeons saw confirmed their worst fears. They had no choice but to remove a portion of his brain, along with most of the frontal bone of his skull, just to relieve the swelling and prevent further deterioration. It was a delicate, desperate procedure, one that no child should ever need. "He's in a coma," one of the doctors later told reporters. "We don't know if he'll ever wake up." Natalia, too, remained in critical condition. Her wounds were severe, and recovery would be long. But unlike her son, she was conscious, aware enough to begin healing, though not yet strong enough to understand the full extent of what had happened. And as the hours turned to days, and the days stretched into weeks, Ivan remained silent. His body was alive, but his mind had not returned. It would be 9 months before that silence began to break. In the weeks that followed the attack, Ivan's condition remained uncertain, but he was still breathing, and that alone gave doctors a reason to keep fighting. After stabilizing him locally, he was transferred to a series of hospitals better equipped to handle his recovery. First, he was moved to the Archangel Regional Children's Hospital, then to a specialized clinic in St. Petersburg, and finally to the renowned Moscow Research Institute of Emergency Children's Surgery. Each move was a step toward hope, but also a reminder of how severe his condition truly was. As the story spread, it didn't just remain a local tragedy. Ivan's case quickly caught the attention of national television. Russian media began covering his journey, and viewers across the country were introduced to the boy who had thrown himself between his mother and a convicted killer. The image of a young teenager, silent in a hospital bed, resonated with millions. One of those moved by the story was Andrei Malakov, a popular Russian TV presenter. He didn't just report on Ivan's condition, he stepped in to help. Through his platform, Malakoff launched a fundraising campaign, urging the public to support the boy's long-term treatment, and the public responded. Donations poured in from across the country. Funds were raised for titanium plates to reconstruct Ivan's skull, as well as for intensive rehabilitation and long-term care. Then, slowly, something changed. 9 months after the attack, Ivan began to show the first signs of life. They were small, almost imperceptible at first, but they meant everything. He could swallow soft foods, something he hadn't done in months. Then, he began to recognize familiar faces, particularly the nurses who had been caring for him. Encouraged by this fragile progress, doctors and supporters began making plans to send Ivan abroad, to Spain, where he could receive specialized neurorehabilitation that wasn't available in Russia. For the first time since that horrific day, there was a flicker of hope. Things were finally starting to look better, and for a family and a country that had held its breath for months, it felt like maybe, just maybe, this boy might survive the impossible. But while Ivan's recovery began to stir national hope, one person remained noticeably absent from his bedside: his mother. Natalia Krapovina, who had survived 27 stab wounds and lived because of her son's sacrifice, was rarely seen at the hospital. Weeks passed, then months, yet she visited only a handful of times. At first, her absence was met with quiet confusion. Then, as Ivan's story became national news and cameras showed an empty space where a mother might have been sitting, the silence turned into something else entirely: public outrage. People began asking hard questions. Why wasn't she there? Why wasn't she fighting for him the way he had fought for her? Rumors spread quickly, and judgment came faster than understanding. And the truth, painful as it was, eventually surfaced. Natalia had turned inward. She began drinking. She struggled with guilt, shock, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Instead of standing at her son's side, she avoided the hospital altogether, unable, she later admitted, to even look at him. It wasn't that she didn't care, it was that she couldn't cope. When she finally spoke publicly, it was during a televised appeal. She sat under the harsh lights of a studio, her hands shaking, her eyes red, and she broke down in tears. "I blame myself," she said. "I couldn't bring myself to see him. Please forgive me. Please help my son." It was a moment that divided the nation. Some saw a broken mother trying to face the unbearable. Others saw abandonment. But whatever people believed, one thing was clear: Natalia wasn't okay. And she hadn't been since the day Ivan walked through that door. By October of 2018, Ivan Krapovin had officially turned 16. It was a birthday that should have marked recovery, a new chapter, maybe even the beginning of something hopeful. But there were no candles, no cake, no visitors gathered around to sing. Instead, Ivan spent the day in a hospital bed, still fragile, still nonverbal, still suspended somewhere between life and something quieter. And then, things took another turn. Despite slow signs of neurological improvement, Ivan's body remained deeply vulnerable, so when he caught the flu, it quickly became something far more dangerous. His immune system couldn't fight back the way it should have, and doctors began to worry. He declined rapidly. In a matter of days, his temperature soared, his breathing changed, and the small progress he had made seemed to fade before their eyes. And then came Igor Commissaro, the senior assistant to the chairman of the investigative committee, the same man who had followed Ivan's case from the beginning. In those final days, Igor did something few expected. He baptized Ivan right there in the hospital ward, because Ivan had never been baptized before, but Igor believed it mattered now, and in doing so, he didn't just perform a rite, he became Ivan's godfather. Then, on December 4th, 2018, after a year and a half of silence, surgeries, and survival, Ivan's body finally gave in. He passed away quietly, leaving behind a nation in mourning, a mother still carrying the weight of guilt, and a story that was far from over. By the time Ivan passed away, Roman Pronin was already behind bars. Months earlier, he had stood trial for attempted murder, a charge stemming from the horrific attack that left Natalia Krapovina with 27 stab wounds and put her son in a coma. The court found him guilty, and he was sentenced to 14 years in a strict regime penal colony. It wasn't the maximum, but it was supposed to mark some form of justice. But when news broke that Ivan had died, everything changed. The case, which had already drawn national attention, was formally reopened, and Pronin's charges were now elevated. This wasn't just attempted murder anymore, it was murder. The prosecution began preparing to hold him accountable for the full weight of Ivan's death. However, Pronin didn't accept that quietly. In court, he doubled down on the same story he'd clung to from the beginning, one that no one ever really believed. He claimed he had walked in on an argument, that Natalia herself was the one attacking Ivan, and that he had only tried to break it up. "I didn't do this," he told the court. "Natalia attacked him. I was breaking up a fight." It was a version of events that defied logic, evidence, and every eyewitness account. Yet he repeated it under oath as if saying it enough times might make it true. But the investigators, those who had walked into that apartment, those who had seen the scene, reviewed the autopsy, and examined the timeline, weren't convinced. The facts didn't support his narrative, the pattern of wounds, the call to his friend, the dumbbell, the knife. Nothing added up to self-defense or intervention. Still, the justice system takes time, and while no final verdict from the reopened case was ever made public, the weight of Ivan's death had already shifted the story. This was no longer just about an attack. It is about a boy who died trying to save his mother, and it was about a man whose violence could no longer be denied, no matter what he said in court. In the months that followed Ivan's death, his name began to carry a different kind of weight, not just as a victim, not just as a headline, but as a symbol of something far greater than the tragedy itself. Across Russia, people remembered the boy who didn't hesitate, the teenager who walked into an unthinkable situation and chose to act, not out of anger, not out of training, but out of love. His bravery didn't just save his mother's life, it challenged an entire nation to think about courage, responsibility, and the cost of being ignored. And so, Ivan Krapovin was honored, not quietly, not in passing, but with two of the country's highest recognitions for civilian valor. He was posthumously awarded the Order of Courage, a prestigious commendation usually reserved for soldiers, first responders, and those who risk their lives in the service of others. He also received the Medal for Valor and Bravery from the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation, a recognition that acknowledged not only his actions, but the moral strength it took to do what he did. His story was told in classrooms, in newsrooms, on talk shows, and on social media platforms that rarely paused for anything. People didn't just mourn him, they carried his image as a quiet reminder of what it means to protect someone you love. But Ivan's legacy didn't just shine a light on his own strength, it also exposed the cracks in a system that allowed a convicted murderer to move in next door to a family that asked for help and got none. It raised hard questions about who gets protected and who gets left behind. So, while Ivan was gone, his memory remained, not just as a statistic or a case file, but as a face, a name, a story that refused to fade. He became a lasting symbol of youthful courage, of institutional failure, and of the quiet, extraordinary love between a mother and her son. Although there is no public record on the final sentencing of Roman Pronin, the man responsible for this unimaginable tragedy, the weight of what he did remains very clear. Ivan Krapovin's story is one that left a scar, not only on a family but on an entire nation. Now, we'd like to hear from you. What do you think could have been done to prevent something like this? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. We read every single one of them. And if this story moved you, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing to our channel for more in-depth true crime stories just like this one. We'll see you in the next video. Until then, take care of yourself and stay safe.